You're watching the Big Picture Business program, Benchmark. Our focus today is corruption and its debilitating effects across our nation. From time to time, the scourge of corruption is debated in public forums, only to be drowned out by the raucous din of disenchanted citizens, be it about the cost of living, the state of infrastructure, and more recently, the leadership training program for university students. Now, however, it appears to be back on the national agenda, thanks to Kumar Sangakkara's recent Colin Cowdrey lecture at Lord's. Although the former Sri Lankan cricket captain talked specifically about the goings-on at Sri Lanka cricket, in his hard-hitting speech, it would be difficult not to draw parallels with the nation at large. Who must now take on the lead in demanding the end to corruption? Does the standard excuse in biz circles that it is impossible to do business without giving into bribery and corruption hold true in a practical sense? Here to offer his valued opinion is a very special guest. He is the former UN Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, who was also in the race for the UN's top job a few years ago, and more recently, a member of the Friday Forum here in Sri Lanka, Jayantha Dhanapala. It's a pleasure to have you back on Benchmark, Mr. Dhanapala. As always, it's great to be talking to you. Now, Sri Lanka has just emerged from another local government election which saw a resounding victory for the Rajapaksa administration, but at the same time, it also showcased the opposition's lack of effectiveness. Now, given all this, how is 2011 actually panning out for this country? Where is it heading?
Well, I think it's fairly clear that the Rajapaksa administration is well established. And since the president got his mandate last year, both in the presidential election and in parliament, he's well established to continue until the end of his term. But what is interesting in this election is the sharp decline in the votes of the opposition, which Rosie Senanayake herself has eloquently pointed out, and also the fact that the TNA have swept the board in the north and the east. Now, I think thereby hangs a tale, and unless the government takes cognizance of that trend, in spite of the malpractices and the numerous other irregularities that are alleged to have taken place in the north, we will have a very serious democracy deficit with regard to the governance of our minorities, because we know that the TNA had to face a lot of odds. And we also know that the government spent a lot of money on economic development in the north and the east. So it is very clear that investment in economic development alone does not solve minority problems. That has been the demonstrable result in a number of developed countries. It's not just a question of having a full stomach and a full purse. It's a question of your identity as a separate ethnic group, where you want to be treated with respect and where you want a certain amount of self-government, where you want a certain amount of devolution of power. It can range from federalism to something much less, but something has to be done. And we haven't done it for 2 years. Now, a number of excuses are being made by the sophisticated apologists of the government to say that 12 years after the American Civil War, nothing was done, and so on and so forth. But we are in the 21st century today. We're not in the 19th century when the American Civil War took place. And surely we can fast forward things, particularly when we have recovered from 3 decades of a civil war which has torn the country apart and which has left so much debris in terms of human losses as well as material losses. We need to therefore expedite a political solution.
There's also been ongoing voices of dissent from the international community, the latest bringing the vote in the US from the Foreign Affairs Committee, which unanimously voted to ban aid to Sri Lanka, and that would cost the country nearly 1.5 billion rupees next year. Now, given all this, that this is going to have a huge effect on Sri Lanka, don't you think?
Well, this is a cumulative effect of the report of the panel of experts appointed by the Secretary General, by the Channel 4 documentary, and by that book The Cage by Gordon Weiss. I have read them all. I've seen the Channel 4 documentary. It is a damning indictment on Sri Lanka, and whether you may contest the veracity, the authenticity or not, the fact it is out there in the public domain, and we have to deal with it. We can't deal with it emotionally and condemn every bit of it as being anti-Sri Lanka government propaganda. We can't all attribute it to the machinations of the Tamil diaspora or the rump of the LTTE who are there out in the Western countries. We have to recognize that this is a coherent body of opinion that has been formulated, and we have to respond to it in a reasoned manner, in a manner that contests its authenticity, and also perhaps, if there are allegations, to have an investigation. But all the ranting and raving that you now have on the part of some spokespersons of the government is not the way to conduct diplomacy. We are going to be faced with bilateral actions such as the decision of the US House of Representatives to suspend aid. There may be other countries which will follow suit. Given the pattern of our aid and our trade and investment, as well as our tourists and the source of our tourists, it's going to hurt the economy.
Is the Obama administration merely playing to the public gallery, given that there's a presidential election scheduled for next year? Isn't the West actually playing playing double standards at the end of the day? We are being investigated for war crimes, but look at where they are.
Well, first of all, with regard to President Obama, let's be realistic and have a sense of proportion. We don't matter so much in the international community that President Obama is going to take a position with regard to Sri Lanka in order to win votes in the 2012 presidential election. So let's put that aside. Yes, there are double standards. It's not a perfect world. Nobody ever said it was. And it is a fact that the Western world has dominated the international scene. The center of gravity in international relations is gradually shifting. So you have the responsibility to protect principle that is so lauded by the West being selectively applied, and that vitiates the fundamental principle behind responsibility to protect, which is a very laudable doctrine, where if you have civilians unprotected because the government is a failed state and is unable to protect them, or is a despotic state and does not want to protect a minority, then the responsibility to protect, which under normal state law is that of the state, then passes to the international community, but validated by the Security Council. Now, this is clearly not happening. However, that does not mean that countries must not observe international humanitarian law and human rights, because we owe it to our own citizens. We owe it to our own constitution in Sri Lanka, where we have human rights entrenched. We have fundamental rights which are justiciable under Article 126. We have signed over 13 human rights conventions, and we are held by the international community to adhere to those. So for all those reasons, we, in our own interests of maintaining good governance and a democracy, we owe it to ourselves to maintain international humanitarian law and human rights, not because the West are saying that, but because our people deserve that.
We take a quick commercial break now. On the other side, Jayantha Dhanapala talks about Kumar Sangakkara's speech at Lords and the biz community's attitude towards corruption. Stay tuned. Thanks for staying with us. You're watching the Big Picture Business program, and we continue with more views and insights from Jayantha Dhanapala. Kumar Sangakkara's Colin Cowdrey lecture, or the address he made at the Home of Cricket on the 4th of July, has put corruption not only in the light of cricket and the cricket establishment, but also perhaps from a national perspective back on the agenda. How do you view his hard-hitting speech?
I thought it was a brilliant speech. For somebody so young to come out with such wonderful views, so superbly articulated and delivered, made me feel very proud as somebody from Kandy and somebody from the same school that he went to. And I wrote to him immediately, and I had a very gracious reply from him. I think he shows leadership material for the country, and not just for the cricket team of Sri Lanka. And I hope he will bear that in mind in the future. But maybe that in itself, like another leader whom we lost, General Densilko Bekadua, might be a black mark against him. But he certainly stood head and shoulders above everybody when he made that speech. And he spoke as a genuinely patriotic Sri Lankan. That was what is wonderful. He encapsulated the ethos, not only of Sri Lanka cricket, but of the country. When he talked about that humble villager sharing a cup of tea, when he talked about the way in which we Sinhalese gave a lot of our Tamil friends shelter in 1983, all that captured the fundamental Sri Lanka. Not that the Sri Lanka that you hear about from politicians on platforms, but this is the true Sri Lanka.
Sangakkara says that since 1996, the doors of Sri Lanka cricket have been opened to, quote, partisan cronies that would lead to corruption and wanton waste of cricket board finances and resources, unquote. Isn't there a parallel here with the nation at large? And if so, who do you think needs to take the lead in demanding an end to the high-level corruption we now see?
The fact of the matter is that as a developing country, we cannot afford any kind of corruption. And corruption means essentially the robbing of the people of their wealth. And when you're a developing country, you can ill afford to rob the people of their wealth when they are just trying to eke out an existence and rise above the poverty level that we have been trapped in ever since we were a colony. We are trying to break the shackles of poverty, and unfortunately corruption holds us back. We have the most enlightened laws in order to battle corruption, but they are not being implemented. And there clearly the political leadership must take the blame. And there clearly you also have to point a finger at the opposition parties for not using their position in Parliament, for not using question time, for not using their position in the Public Accounts Committee, in COPE and other organizations in order to raise these issues. Why aren't they not speaking up? And why aren't they not using the powers that they have to point out this corruption? We are all corrupt in some way or another, because corruption takes two forms. There is a giver of a bribe and the taker of a bribe. And if people give bribes, they are as guilty as the person who takes the bribe. How many members of the private sector are not openly guilty of this? I would ask them all to show whether their hands are clean. There is the Lanka Monthly Digest, which has this very principled campaign against corruption, and I take my hat off to them. But how many others are really willing to go after those who are in fact corrupt?
Mr. Dhanapala, the standard excuse in business circles is it is impossible to do business without giving in to bribery and corruption. Now, does this hold true in a practical sense? There are allegations that you can't win a tender, that you need to give something to gain business, because otherwise your business might fold up or your business suffers. So in a practical ground reality sense, what do you think we need to do?
It is a spineless, cowardly comment on the part of the private sector. They have chambers of commerce which have very high ethical standards and which preach to the world about these ethical standards. Corporate social responsibility has become today a mantra chanted by every private sector leader. Where is the practice of this? If all of them unite and say, okay, we will not tender for such and such a job unless there is a clean competition and unless there is no hint at all about any bribery, do you think anybody can have a tender procedure then? If all the key persons, either in an engineering sector of business or in some other sector which is involved in the tender procedure, unite and say, we will not have any participation in this tender procedure unless we have these assurances. Obviously, they are in a commanding position, and they will, unless, of course, foreign companies are brought in which case we will know that they are being brought in precisely because our local companies have stood firm on this question of no bribery. The public will know that, and there will be public opinion that will rise. So it is the weak-kneed response of the private sector that encourages corruption.
And you can watch part 2 of our interview with Jayantha Dhanapala next week. It's time now for another commercial break, and when we return, we take a closer look at the economic outlook for the second half of this year. Stay with us.